welcome to this 2020 WCA Annual Conference virtual workshop. Thank you for participating in our online event. We also want to thank our annual partners and sponsors for their commitment and ongoing support of our 2020 WCA Annual Conference. Please note our virtual workshop presenters will answer questions at the end of their presentation. Be sure to type in your question in the chat or Q&A section at the bottom of your page. If you've called in, simply hit *9 to raise your hand and be unmuted by the host. Again, thank you for your participation in today's WCA Annual Conference virtual workshop. We hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to PFAS and PFOS. What does it all mean? And I hope by the time that we're done with this session, you'll have a little bit better idea of these phrases that you've probably heard recently and what it means to you and your life and possibly to your community. So just a little bit of information on me. Again, my name is Meleesa Johnson. I am the director of the Marathon County Solid Waste Department, and I wear a lot of different hats. And as you can see there, in that capacity, I am always very open to having policymakers and others contact me, asking questions about waste reduction, recycling, landfilling, composting, anything to do with solid waste management. Please, after this presentation, if you think of something later, zip me off an email or call me. Happy to have a chat with you. So what is a PFAS and a PFOS? I can tell you that about 2.5 years ago, I hadn't a clue what that meant. In fact, I don't think I had ever heard those letters switched together to create an acronym. That has changed over the last couple of years, and I'll share a lot of that information on how it's changed my life as a solid waste professional and the work that I do with my colleagues, not only in Marathon County, but throughout the state of Wisconsin and actually throughout the United States. PFAS and PFOS are a group of chemicals with a long name, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They are man-made and they were discovered by accident. In the 30s, 3M was doing some work connecting with kind of the U.S. Army, I believe it was, and looking for some different opportunities. And a researcher dropped some of this substance that they had worked to create onto a shoe. And gosh darn, he cleaned it up, and the next day or a couple of days later, he came back and noticed that that area of his shoe appeared to be consistently resistant to water and stains. And that gave birth to PFAS and PFOS. So it was really an accident, which is now kind of transcended into over 5,000 chemicals in this category. And you can see off on the side there, sort of that organic chemistry setup of all the carbons in the fluorines and the oxygen and hydrogen. That'll take different forms. Sometimes there's sulfur attached to this. Sometimes there's more hydrogen, sometimes there's more oxygen, but it will always contain carbons and fluorines together. And you'll notice those fluorine sitting on the outside of that. It is really then serving to protect those inner carbon chains. It really creates a solid, impenetrable force against trying to get at those carbons. So 3M said, hey, we got something here. We're going to start producing this. And they started en masse, just sort of producing this in the 40s after the war. And they designed it as a surfactant. So basically it changes the surface tension of water, and it works really well at doing that. It is hydrophobic, which is weird. It repels water and it repels grease. So it does both of those things. But it will be suspended in liquids and also can dissolve in liquids and dissolve in protein. So it's a weird sort of chemical that has some very distinct and unique properties. Over the course of years, of course, these things were used in great abundance, and I'll show you a number of ways in which you'll find these very familiar. But what happened is, of course, you all probably read stories or even remember how we used to dispose of a lot of our waste products. Wetlands were a popular place, old quarries, rivers. So now this stuff is being disposed of. At the time, that's the way they did it. Not saying that's good, bad, or indifferent, but that's the way waste was handled many decades ago, 100 years ago. And those waste chemicals found their way into the human blood system. And in fact, not only human blood, but there have been blood serum studies of polar bears, yes, polar bears, which have PFAS in their bloodstream as well. The early studies were just noting the organofluorines. So they thought mostly that at that time that they were associated with pesticides and herbicides, because organofluorines are also used in pesticides and herbicides. But in the 60s, they found, after some more detailed analysis, these were in fact PFAS and PFOS. In the 1990s, of course, 3M kind of figured out that they might have to do a little bit more study on this. And they evaluated the global blood banks, and yes, PFAS and PFOS were found in our global blood banks. This prompted 3M to evaluate some of the more egregious in this category, the PFOSs and the PFOAs. And they began phasing those out, and you'll hear those referenced as the long chain carbon. So they can be up to 12 carbons in a chain. These are the more challenging of the PFAS and PFOS. And 3M said, you know what, we're going to phase these out. They also sent out notifications to other companies who used PFAS and PFOS, including DuPont, and said, hey, these things are bad. We're going to phase them out. You need to start thinking about this. Interestingly, that phase out, now there's a new study out that's showing that there appears to be a connection. So there's a correlation. There's not direct causation. That the phase out of the PFAS, PFOAs, and the PFOSs appears to have correlated with a reduction of these compounds in the bloodstream. So, and this will be important because it'll be my very last point when I go through this. Remember that they've phased out these more challenging PFAS that have been shown to be dangerous to human health. And as a result, there appears to be a correlation in the reduction of PFAS and PFOS in blood serum. That's an important point. And sadly, it's bound to happen, right? Humans, we create all of these chemicals because we want them to do something for us. We want them to either kill quackgrass or make something grow bigger or stronger or somehow protect us. Unfortunately, a category of PFAS have been shown to have some pretty significant health impacts. And there needs to be more study done. There are a number of studies out there. Some of them are large studies, some of them are over time, and so we're still trying to understand that. But there is, without question, there is some causation to show that there are health impacts of these compounds. Excuse me. Interestingly, on the second bullet, the very last few words, it says we need to understand the impacts of PFAS and the new short chain carbons. So the longer chain carbon, as you recall from my last slides, have been phased out. So now there's a new product called Gen X, and those are shorter chain, 4 and 6 chain carbons. And they were introduced as an alternative surfactant to these longer chain, more egregious, damaging PFAS and PFOS. We still don't know what the impact is to our health from those items. Those don't break down as well either, so they may be as persistent as some of the PFAS and PFOS. they may indeed also bioaccumulate in our blood and tissues. Right now, the EPA is considering classifying at least PFOAs and PFOSs as hazardous compounds under CERCLA. And if that happens, the natural extension of that would be that many of the compound waste products would then become hazardous wastes. So kind of that we start out with a hazardous compound, and when those compounds are no longer useful, they become waste. If it is hazardous, it may end up being a hazardous waste. We will have to see what happens during this rulemaking process. So PFAS in our lives. I'd like to show the next couple of slides to help bring context. And I should preface this at this point. Everything that I'm talking about here, all the context I'm trying to bring, all the slides I'm showing, I do not want anyone to think that this is undermining or somehow diminishing the concerns of people who are impacted by PFAS and PFOS contamination. The folks up in Marinette and Peshtigo, the folks in Starkweather Creek and Madison, these and others. This isn't about that. They have serious health concerns and we should be addressing those. My goal here is to help you understand that while those situations, whether it's Tyco having a spill into a canal that goes into the Marinette River or the Peshtigo River, or firefighting foam, and we'll be talking about that in just a minute, contaminating land and then having that run it off into rivers and streams and contaminating groundwater. Those things are terrible situations. We have to figure out how to correct those. But I'm showing you these slides because I want you to see how ubiquitous this stuff is in our lives. My ops manager, Dave, took all of last week off. He's putting in new windows and new siding on his home. And he sent me a text and he goes, "Hey, Meleesa, I just got done putting PFAS around my house." So that DuPont product is sold, if you go to their website, in that Tyvek home wrap. And it's sold, it says, unique characteristics to keep out moisture. You'll see the fast food sitting there. Who doesn't love a good greasy burger? At least I do. And if you're vegetarian, I apologize, but I really enjoy a good greasy burger. That wrapper is coated with PFAS and PFOS to help keep the grease in and not have that grease drip onto your brand new suit or brand new jacket. Dental floss. Many people don't realize that a lot of our personal care products, especially those items that are supposed to be slippery, that glide, like dental floss, all-day mascara is waterproof. How does it get waterproof? PFAS. And of course, Teflon cookware. And interestingly, there's a commercial out right now about this brand new cookware. It is PFOA free. That doesn't mean that it doesn't contain PFAS. It just doesn't contain some of the more challenging PFOAs and PFOSs. So they're playing little kind of fast and loose with the marketing of that. But if your cookware says it's nonstick, it has some kind of PFAS. Popcorn bags, same thing. You love your stain-free furniture and carpeting. Stain-free just means that it's been coated with a PFAS. And I'm showing the jacket because it is, of course, rain resistant, water resistant. I was giving this presentation at the Marathon County Environmental Resources Committee, and a reporter, after I was done, I think he kind of wanted to say, well, he kind of presents it like this. He said, "Meleesa, I think, I was ready to say, the solid waste industry needs to do something about PFAS. You can't be taking in this stuff and releasing all of your leachate, so the liquid that goes into the landfill, back into the environment. The PFAS are going to get out." He said, "I was all prepared to blame you until you showed the photo of the Gore-Tex jacket." And I looked over at him, and sure enough, on the lapel, his jacket said Gore-Tex. That jacket has some type of PFAS coating. It is in our lives, in our homes, in our offices, our schools, our hospitals. It is everywhere. As I said before, firefighting foam is really nothing more than a surfactant. It enhances the capability of water to put out fires. PFAS are incredibly resistant to heat, thousands of degrees in temperature, and they will not break down their surfactant qualities. So that fire extinguisher you have, and rightfully so, every home should have one, it contains some type of PFAS. It does what we want it to do, right? That grease fire in the kitchen because you lost track of the fact that you were doing something and now you have a little bit of a fire on the stovetop. You definitely want something that's going to douse that fire quickly. Excuse me. And then the photo of all of that black smoke is the refinery fire in Superior a couple of years ago. Complex fires like this are fought with what's called Class B firefighting foam. It is an intense type of firefighting foam that is specifically formulated to not break down with additional waters or in extraordinarily high temperatures. Its main purpose is to smother these fires. And of course, it eventually did. However, what remained was sediment and debris now coated with PFAS. And interestingly, this is fairly new. A researcher at UW-Madison, Sea Grant, has been doing some research on PFAS and PFAS exposure. And his research is finding that even rainwater now has PFAS. And this is primarily driven, and again, this is only speculation at this point, there's not a cause and effect. When PFAS are emitted into the air, that happens in a variety of ways. Of course, it becomes airborne, it attaches to our rain molecules, and they fall from the sky. Unfortunately, if you were caught out in the rain like I was yesterday, I probably got a dousing of PFAS, and I did not have rain resistant gear on. I just plain got soaked. This information came from a presentation, I believe it was the Department of Health Services and exposure routes. So one of the things we talk about is, well, if this is everywhere, right? It's in our homes, it's everywhere. It's persistent, it's bioaccumulating, it's in the water, it's in the land, it's everywhere, it's in our blood. How did it get there? And what we need to think about is in three ways, as you can see the 3 bullet points. And the graph off to the side, you'll notice there are a number of persistent organic compounds listed there, DDTs, toxophanes, a lot of different very persistent, dangerous organic compounds that do bioaccumulate and end up in our food system. For adults, your number one exposure, typically, unless you're a firefighter, unless you are working in a metal plating plant, any of those locations where PFAS may be used in great numbers, as an adult, your number one pathway for exposure is going to be the food you eat. Food packaging, as you saw with the fast food burger, and it's not just fast food burgers. I don't want to blame just fast food. It's all the packaging. So if you open up your pantry and you open a box of whatever, noodles or whatever, and that packaging has a coating on it, it is very likely that that coating is PFAS. And I like the little factoid. So if you would eat 2 inches of French fries, that is equal to taking in PFAS at 20 parts per trillion if you drank 2 liters of water. So you can see how easily our consumption of food ends up exposing us to PFAS. And the pathway for food is also, if this is in our soils, some plants do have an uptake. And so therefore, that is coming into the food system, not only by packaging, but also by growing and taking up the PFAS through the plant system. For children, it's the dust in our home. Of course, I showed you the photo of the stain-resistant sofa. We have stain-resistant carpets, and we love those things. We pay a lot of money for those things. We want to keep them nice and fresh and clean. But if you run the vacuum cleaner, which I'm assuming you do, I do because I have dogs in the house, that process will release PFAS and they will become airborne. So children are exposed by the dust in our homes and schools. And then for children or infants, it's breast milk and then in utero. So there's a number of different pathways which account for the fact that globally we're seeing PFAS in blood banks. And it accounts for headlines like these, and you've probably all seen them, right? You've heard stories on the news, you've seen these newspaper accounts on the radio, you've heard them. Excuse me. This is a serious concern, and that's why I say I am not here to diminish those concerns or somehow say that there isn't merit in every single one of those headlines. But this is, again, 2.5 years ago, nobody was talking about PFAS. We now know that this is a significant concern, and these headlines demonstrate that that concern has now kind of floated to the top part in the pond when talking about a surfactant. This too is why we have growing concerns. And this is just a few of what they're calling the hotspots, right? Most of these are manufacturing locations. Of course, you see the one just above the Bay of Green Bay. Those are the Tyco facilities in Marinette and Peshtigo. The ones down by Milwaukee are typically with the airport. Interestingly, Class B firefighting foams, large airports are required under federal law to practice with those firefighting foams to ensure that they're ready in the case of a plane crash. So because they have to practice as a part of their federal licensure, many of those larger airports will have soil contamination and groundwater contamination of PFAS and PFOS. So this is dotted around the state, and of course you see the dot up by Superior, and that's from the fire at the refinery. As we learn more, as we do more sampling, as we better understand the sources, our entire state will be all of these dots. They will be everywhere, especially if we're having deposition through rainwater. And we better understand and get better at measuring PFAS and PFOS in the environment. So right now what's happening, well, what's not happening, let's start there. The US EPA has not set any federal guidelines. I'll say that again. The US EPA has been exploring for the last several years setting guidelines or standards, I should say. However, they have not done that yet. So there is no national standard or limits for safe drinking water, groundwater standards, surface water standards, soil standards. They have advisory limits of 70 parts per trillion of PFOAs and PFOSs. Again, those are just two of the compounds within the 5,000 that I had talked about earlier. And of course, if the federal government doesn't take action, what do the states do? In the good old federalist system, we take that on ourselves. And you can see that many states are already either setting standards, setting health advisory limits, or proposing limits that will help protect people from exposure. In Wisconsin, the last legislative cycle was very, very active in proposals coming forward related to PFAS. The one I have highlighted in blue is the only one that made it out of committee and into law. This one is the one related to firefighting foams. Remember those Class B firefighting foams, and it will ban those firefighting foams. And it also allows the DNR rule-making authority related to those firefighting foams. And the idea is we want to transition fire departments away from those more dangerous firefighting foams We want to get them collected. We also want to set up a system, and that's what Wisconsin Act 101 would set up a system for. Should there be a release, so a use of those firefighting foams, there's a notification method back to DNR, and also then a standard by which that those materials, whether it's the soils or the water runoff, is allowed back into the environment after treatment. So that rulemaking authority is in process. However, at the August, the August Natural Resources Board, they actually set these aside until October now. There was some concerns about some of the language, some of the standards. So there was a bit of delay. We should be seeing something coming out of the Natural Resources Board on that rulemaking for Act 101. All of those other bills, as you see there, they either languished, saw no floor action, passed and were ready for scheduling, but never made it out for full approval by either house. The regulatory agency response, the DNR and the Department of Health Services have been working collaboratively for about the last almost 2 years, excuse me, to set technical or as technical advisory committees. Basically, that first bullet, examine what, where, when, and how PFAS is potentially impacting Wisconsin. Because as I said, 2 or 3 years ago, this wasn't the topic. We were probably talking about lead service lines into homes, or we were talking about particulate matter causing increased asthma. PFAS wasn't on anybody's radar. So these technical advisory committees have been meeting on a regular basis to better understand things, to help, inform the rulemaking process, inform standard setting. But the one bullet that says develop regulatory standards to protect public health and the environment from PFAS contamination, all I can think of is going back to the slide I showed you on how PFAS affect our lives and in our homes. And, this is such a complex web of, what we want as consumers, but what we also want to protect our families and our health. This is such a complex issue because it has just so many tentacles coming into this. The other one I think of note, and it's something I hope you all think about, is the second to the last bullet, the last few words. Protect Wisconsin taxpayers from uncertain and costly liabilities associated with PFAS. If you take that language and now think about it, let's go backwards. How do we determine those liabilities? And that then rests back on the manufacturers, the people who made these products. Those are the ones that actually bear some of that responsibility. So I find that interesting. I haven't heard a whole lot of talk about, although at one meeting I did hear discussion or asking the question, should Wisconsin enter a class action lawsuit against the manufacturers of PFAS and PFOS? If Wisconsin taxpayers are left paying for this, someone needs to help us out, because you know what, Wisconsin taxpayers are already paying for plenty, and adding this burden to it seems a bit unfair. This is something that came out of the technical advisory committee's meeting, and some of the work that DNR is doing directly with the Peshtigo and Marinette area to better understand the impact of Tyco and their manufacture of PFAS-containing foam, firefighting foam. The DNR is going to be sending out, or has sent out, letters to a number of households in that area and offering to pay for, and have done, actually Tyco would be paying for it, Johnson Controls, to sample potable well sources within this, as you see on the left, in those areas highlighted. This will be an interesting thing I'm anxious to see the results of this, to see how far-flung this is impacting the community. And what will happen once we find out this information, if a potable well source, a property, is now identified as a PFAS containing area. What will this mean to property values? What will it mean to remediation costs? A lot of unknowns, but the reason I'm showing you this is Wisconsin is taking action. It's a laborious process. We still have a lot of work to do, but this is just one thing to help us better understand the impact. The other is that the governor issued Executive Order 40, and I think it was last December or November, I can't remember specifically, to create the Wisconsin PFAS Action Council, or WISPAC, as we call it, and refer to it. WISPAC is all of the governor's administrative agencies. They are sending a representative to the table, and they literally sit around a very large table and problem solve and discuss and evaluate the issue of PFAS and its impact on the state of Wisconsin. So everybody from the Department of Revenue to the DNR to the UW system to the state school, everything. And they literally sit around this table, and they have been doing that for over almost a year now. And they've been doing an incredible amount of outreach. They've been having listening sessions, and they are hearing from the public. They are hearing from industry. They are hearing from experts. And they are taking all of this information that they have brought in over the course of this year, and they developed a draft document, an action plan, which was exactly as the governor had charged them. Tell us what we need to do. That action plan was released last month, and the major categories of those recommendations, as you can see there, are listed. So standard setting, sampling, pollution prevention, these are all broad categories. Within each one of those broad categories, there's anywhere from 1 to 4 or 5 different actions within those categories. Now, my colleagues and I have been spending time evaluating this because it impacts us, and I'll be talking about that in just a moment. It impacts the solid waste industry. But we believe that research and knowledge should be first. We cannot set standards or better understand how to sample or create pollution prevention strategies until we have the research and knowledge to underpin all of that. So we would like to see a reordering of that, and we will be submitting comments as such. And we also think that phasing out of PFAS and PFOS, remember the slide where I showed you that there was a correlation between a drop in blood serum concentrations of PFOAs and PFOSs and the stopping of their production. Phasing out is probably one of the biggest strategies for pollution prevention. I've listed the URL here. If you, your community, your county board, your department, or you as an individual citizen are interested in this topic and would like to comment, review, submit information, please go to that URL, take a look at the action plan. It's an easy read. It's an easy read. You'll find it easy to follow, and I think you'll find it logical. I encourage you to go there because this affects all of us. Under future investments, down at the bottom, and again, that should probably be up a little bit farther, it talks about providing funding to local government, because local governments are going to be, again, yet one more time, are going to be left trying to figure out what this means for our budgets. And here's a prime example. Wastewater treatment plants very likely are going to have some system to treat or remove PFAS and PFOS. Now, I realize many of you may be on county boards, but some of you may be on town boards, city councils, etc. This means a cost increase to your ratepayers. This has a direct impact to your taxpayers. So what will it mean for local government in trying to fix this? And as always seems to be the case, local government is left trying to figure out the solution. So future investments, one of the key things, and again, I would encourage you all to go to this, is funding back to local governments to figure out how to manage the challenge of PFAS. So PFAS and waste management, and this is how I got involved. Again, I am not a chemist. I am not a scientist. I am not an engineer. My degree is environmental policy and planning with an emphasis in public policy and regulatory policy. I got involved because, again, the gentleman who talked with me after the presentation, the gentleman with the Gore-Tex jacket, he wanted to blame landfills. Because landfills, what do? We receive all the stuff you no longer want. All those popcorn bags. You eat the popcorn, what do you do with the bag? It goes in the garbage. You have a pot or a pan, you're done with it, what do? You throw it in the garbage. That old mascara goes in the garbage. My industry, my colleagues and I, across the state, across this nation, what we do is take care of the things you don't want. We have no control over that, but we bust our butts trying to figure out how to do it the best we can so those things you don't want don't harm you. However, we are very frequently blamed because we're at the end of the pipe. Just like wastewater treatment facilities, and you see the wastewater treatment facility there below the photo of the landfill, we're at the end of the pipe. We can't stop the stuff coming to us. It would be a catastrophic environmental issue if we said, sorry, we're going to stop taking this stuff. We can't do that. So we receive all of this stuff, and it's not just landfills, it's not just wastewater treatment facilities. Remember I talked about all of that packaging that has PFAS and PFOS? If you throw those PFAS and PFOS in the recycling bin, and I want you to throw that cardboard container or that packaging into the recycling bin, it's going to end up on our recycling stream. If we compost, and I do, I'm looking out at my backyard right now, I have a great compost bin, very likely there's PFAS and PFOS in there because I do throw into my compost non-recyclable papers, and of course my food may have it. And I'm showing a photo of a paper mill, that's actually the Park Falls paper mill. Post-consumer mills, those mills that take post-consumer paper and make, and this mill I don't believe uses post-consumer, it's just an image of a paper mill. Those mills will have a waste product called sludge, and that sludge, because they're using post-consumer papers, which may have PFAS and PFOS, that may end up in their sludge. So the waste management system, we're at the end of the pipe. We are heavily impacted by everything that's going on with PFAS. Again, this just shows that relationship, starting with your house, you put it in the garbage, our factories, we have, of course, the hazardous waste or pollutants. They're going to a landfill, they're going to a wastewater treatment facility. And interesting, if you look, there's a back and forth arrow between the landfill and the wastewater treatment facility. Landfills produce leachate, so that's the water that percolates through the waste mass and is collected at the base of the landfill, pumped out. It is sent to wastewater treatment facilities for treatment, primary, secondary, tertiary, before it goes out into a waterway. And then the wastewater treatment facility produces a sludge. On occasion, that sludge comes back to landfill. So that back and forth relationship, we are inextricably tied, wastewater and solid waste. The other interesting thing about municipal wastewater sludge is it is frequently applied to farm fields as a soil amendment. And this is not some nefarious plot to throw PFAS out onto farm fields. This material is actually organically rich, and it has a lot of capabilities to enhance soils and to also lock in nutrients. Unfortunately, we're starting to find that perhaps some of those sludges may contain PFAS. So you see that little forest there, the plants growing. That is the relationship all the way down that. We're all tied to this. We are all absolutely tied to this because of all of those things we have talked about previously. My colleagues and I firmly believe that we need a global solution, because if all we're going to do is look at the end of the pipe and not change any of our consumer habits and not change any of the things about PFAS, we will be locked into this perpetual cycle of PFAS at the end of the pipe. It's not going to change things. It's just going to change how we deal with them. They're going to be there. We need a global solution. Wisconsin can't do this alone. Marathon County can't do it alone. Dane County can't do it alone. The United States can't do it alone. We need a global solution to best manage protecting our environment and humans from these compounds. The other thing you should, if you ever get a chance, and I did have a slide about this, but I removed it for length. The United Nations has had a convention. It's called the Stockholm Convention, and it's about persistent organic pollutants in our environment. And in fact, there's the dirty dozen. PFAS and PFOS are on that list, but there are 10 other persistent organic pollutants that threaten our environment and our public health. Many of them are still being produced and used throughout the world. And so this isn't just PFAS and PFOS. We need a global solution to all persistent organic pollutants to firmly and affirmatively address this. And you're going to say, how the heck, Meleesa, do we get this done? And I've got Smokey Bear. I love Smokey Bear because he's going, I can't do this myself. I need your help. And there's a few examples I think we can use of showing what happens when good people want to do the right thing. We all know that there's been a ban on building materials containing asbestos. They still do enter the country. It's not a complete ban, but we have abated most issues related to asbestos. Our schools no longer have asbestos threatening the health of children. We've removed lead from gasoline, and that was a result of us realizing that out of the tailpipe of our cars, we were emitting lead that was poisoning our environment. The Montreal Protocol said CFCs are destroying the ozone. Countries across the world signed on to the Montreal Protocol, and we phased out chlorofluorocarbons that were destroying the ozone. Cosmetics. How many scenes have you seen of a little bunny and his eyes are just swollen and pink and red and awful and pussy? Because years ago we used to test cosmetics on little bunny rabbits and other animals. We said, stop doing that because nobody wants to see that, right? So we've phased out, consumers demanded phasing out testing on animals, and that's what's happening. BPA-free products, baby bottles containing BPA. Parents across this country said, we do not want BPA in our babies' bottles. And guess what? That consumer action changed the BPA landscape. Consumers, I know it's very hard and we all feel hopeless sometimes, but our greatest strength is in working together. And our other greatest strength, we are collectively trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of buying power. We can make a difference by demanding that our coats are not, our rain resistant gear is not coated with PFAS, or that our kitchenware doesn't have Teflon. We can make a difference. But it really all starts with you becoming educated, becoming part of the process, being informed, and helping to make that change. I've enjoyed working with you today, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Meleesa. We are now going to open things up for questions. As a reminder, thank you, sorry about that. As a reminder, you can type your questions down below in chat or in the Q&A section, and we will get going on those right now. Our first question, Meleesa, comes in. Is there any thought toward an impact tax that would serve as a chemical cleanup fund similar to petroleum and fertilizers?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad the participant brought it up. One of the funds that is actually being talked about, and this is probably being talked about as it relates to the firefighting foam, the collection of the firefighting foam, and that is the environmental management account. And many of you may be familiar with that. That's the account that funds our county conservation programs. It funds our clean sweep programs for household hazardous waste. It funds our local recycling programs. That money comes from a fee charged at solid waste landfills across the state of Wisconsin. And there's a few other sources, but about 80% of that fund comes from solid waste landfill fees. There is some discussion of using at least some money out of that fund to pay for firefighting foam collected from fire departments across the state. Is a really good question about creating a fund like we did for PFAS or the petroleum cleanup and then for fertilizers. But we would have to figure out where we assess the fee. Is that on the purchase of a Teflon pan? So you go into the grocery store and you buy something that is a package that has PFAS in the packaging. Is there a fee added to that up front? So I think it's a good question. I would love to see a fund similar to that, but we'd have to decide who pays the fee, where is it assessed, and then how is it used? Does it go into the environmental management account, or does it go to a separate account that is just dedicated for PFAS? But there's a lot of discussion about what this is going to cost, and it's pretty monumental.
How does this issue relate to microplastics?
There is, other than they're both pollutants, there is really no correlation between the microplastics and PFAS. Of course, microplastics are those tiny little bits of plastic, like my sweater right here is polyester. So when I wash it, little bits of polyester fibers are released. Those that go down, of course, the drain and out to the wastewater treatment facility and out into the Wisconsin River. At least from where I live, they go into the Wisconsin River and just exist forever. I mean, their relationship to PFAS is they're a pollutant. They're also just there, and they probably won't break down. But chemically, they're just very, very different. They are not in the same category.
Is there an alternative safe material that can be used in its place, and is it cost effective?
That's a good question, and I do not have the complete answer to that. You know, when I was growing up, which I would sound like my grandpa now, when I was growing up, I had to walk 5 miles uphill. But when I was growing up, our rain gear was not PFAS. It was a rubber jacket or a kind of plastic jacket. And that's what we wore for rain gear. So is it a transition to something more historic that we've used that is less problematic? I think that's a good question. Or are there components of PFAS that we find so valuable in that gear that we want to keep it? That's a consumer driven thing. But I think more research needs to be put into how do we. Here's the other thing is, if you recall, again, when I was young, I'm going to say that a lot until I'm getting old, butter was wrapped in wax paper. So it would be cut in quarters, and it was a waxy paper that, and then you bought your pound of butter. That wax paper, of course, we transitioned away from that because it was paraffin, which is a petroleum distillate. So we didn't want the paraffin, so we transitioned into wrapping our butter with PFAS coated paper. So there's this give and take, and there is no perfect solution, but I am not familiar with any fabric at this point that is that different that will give the same qualities as a PFAS coated fabric.
Our next question, does this cause any type of cancer?
There have been some correlations to cancer. I believe thyroid cancer is one of them, and I don't know, and I'm trying to remember now, so I don't want to misquote, but it was one of the PFOAs or PFOSs that had a pretty distinct correlation with thyroid cancer. I believe there were some other cancers where there was a relationship, but there's definitely a correlation. And of course, you all recall for years and years and years, we knew there was a correlation between smoking, cigarettes, and lung cancer. Finally, of course, all the studies those causal studies were proved as distinct and relationship directed. So yes, there is some indication that it may cause cancer.
Are any treatment technologies readily available that could be installed at WWTP for removal or many years away?
There is a plethora and flurry of research going into treatment systems. And again, I just want you to remember these treatment systems, all they do is kind of condense and consolidate the PFAS. So reverse osmosis, and many of you may be familiar with reverse osmosis, passing water through a membrane to remove contaminants. Some of you may even have it on your home water systems. Those larger systems are actually being deployed to treat drinking water and wastewater coming out of wastewater treatment facilities and out of landfills. But again, it just consolidates the PFAS. There are granulated activated carbon systems. There are a number of different systems. All of them, again, just consolidated into either filters or membranes or resins. Then those leftovers need to go back into a landfill. So that's why we keep cycling things through. They're expensive systems, hopefully like the microwave, which cost $1,000 when it first came out, and now you can buy it for $50. Hopefully as we do more research on these systems, and they will come down in price. But yes, there are a number of systems being currently used and evaluated.
What can consumers do to protect themselves from PFAS?
Well, it's the little things. I like the butterfly wings, I always like the analogy. Again, we all feel hopeless some days, like we can't do anything. But I'm working with a group right now, kind of as their solid waste technical advisor on PFAS. And one of the women in this group helping us write a paper on it, she goes, I had no idea. She goes, I went through my house and I got rid of the dental floss and I went out and bought PFAS-free, wax-free dental floss, got rid of all the cosmetics that may contain it. Ask questions. Does this contain PFAS? And if you're not satisfied, then move on to something else. I'm in the process of phasing out all of my Teflon to stainless steel and cast iron. It's an expensive proposition, but last night I made my hearty beef stew in a stainless steel pot free of PFAS.
What are some of the technologies to treat for PFAS, and what is the anticipated cost?
Again, as I mentioned before, what we're looking at is probably some kind of multiple system. Reverse osmosis, granulated activated carbon, resin systems, ionization systems, all of these systems are being evaluated. Right now for Marathon County, again, this is from my perspective as the director there, we're looking at a on-site wastewater treatment facility that would probably cost to treat our 18 million gallons of leachate a year. We're probably looking about $1 million to $1.2 million a year to treat that for PFAS.
Our next question, is there any discussion of a class action lawsuit against the manufacturers of PFAS?
Again, there was some pretty broad discussion about it at one of the WSPAC meetings. Could this be a strategy? I would love to see that discussion broadened. Again, it's going to cost my department a lot of money to treat for PFAS. We have to do that. We'll do what we have to do to protect the environment. But again, it goes back to who's really paying for this then. We will pass probably the cost on to our users. Again, wastewater treatment facilities will pass that cost on to rate users. Ultimately, it's going to cost taxpayers money. And why should the taxpayers have to bear the biggest burden here? We just settled the lawsuit with the pharmaceutical company on OxyContin. That was a national class action lawsuit, which of course Wisconsin was a part of. It will help to pay for some of those costs. So I think it's an appropriate discussion. We'll see if policymakers want to, and the DOJ would want to pursue that.
Great. The first article, next question here, Meleesa. The first article I saw in the news last year on PFAS was a farmer in Texas who was losing his herd to PFAS. It was devastating. The cattle were dying in the fields and he was ordered to dump 20,000 plus gallons of milk a day. The farmer then had no income or funds to help dispose of the dead cattle. Are we attempting to be proactive in Wisconsin to help protect farmers with this issue?
I would say the answer is yes, because we are already starting to have the discussion about the use of biosolids on and land application, what that means. I have two colleagues right now who are working on the fate and transport. So what happens to PFAS, the fate and transport in biosolids? Is it indeed, does it kind of break down once exposed to sunlight? Is there uptake into plants? There's a lot of research, and farmers across the state are having conversations with both DNR and of course the wastewater treatment facilities. But this gets back to this, as I said, this wasn't a nefarious plot to get rid of a product that nobody wanted. It just happened. So, but we need to protect our farmers, because many of the farmers that have used the biosolids are not the large corporate farms. They are the small farmer, the one that we are losing every day. We need to find a way to protect them. And if they are negatively impacted, we need to make sure they're taken care of.
Meleesa, our next question. What are the primary health hazards caused by PFAS?
Again, these are all correlations. So they don't indicate causation, they are correlations. They are thyroid issues, some cancers. I believe one was testicular cancer may have been attributed in some correlation. Those are the primary things. And again, they're discovering more as they move along. But people exposed to large amounts of PFOAs and PFOSs in particular have been showing detrimental health impacts, including, I believe one of them, and this is a study out of, was it Pennsylvania or Connecticut? I'm sorry if I blitzed on that, that had just absolute decay of teeth and terrible mouth issues. So, and I think that was in relationship to DuPont's disposal of PFAS and PFOS.
If wastewater treatment plants cannot land spread biosolids, how much landfill space would we need to dispose of the biosolids?
That is, I actually had some students at UWSP working on that last spring as a capstone project, because if we can't land apply it, then what we send it to landfills, but you just can't add these biosolids and sludges into the waste mass. They have to be worked in with other municipal solid waste. The sludge is unconsolidated, and what it does in a landfill, it creates instability, sort of geotechnical instability, which creates slides and slumps and really hazards. So in order to accommodate the 500,000 ton a year of biosolids, if it were no longer to go to farm fields, we would need a 500,000 cubic yards a year of landfill airspace. But more importantly, we would need 5 million cubic yards of solid waste to mix that in to make sure any landfill has a stable waste mass that wouldn't be a threat to anybody on that surface.
Are there other organic compounds that we should be concerned about?
As I mentioned, the Stockholm Convention has a list of the dirty dozen, and there are a number of those, and I cannot remember them off the top of my head. Of course, DDT is still out there because unfortunately it is still used in some parts of the world, but I would advise anyone who is concerned about persistent organic compounds to Google Stockholm Convention, and you will see the dirty dozen list. So yes, there are a number of them. The other thing is, you know, we still know we have health impacts from lead service lines, which I had mentioned previously. What is the health? We know some of the health impacts of that. So we still should add that into the matrix. We've got PFAS, we've got lead service lines going into homes. In my part of the state in central Wisconsin, of course, we're dealing, in other parts, we're dealing with nitrates in groundwater. We have a lot of things going on that are threatening our health. Microplastics, again, was mentioned. This is an issue. So I think a discussion on our risk level and the health impacts of all of those as we start investing in solutions is really going to be important for policymakers to have.
Is there a chemical that neutralizes these PFAS and PFOS?
There is not. They love life. Let's put it that way. Once they're created, they hang on stubbornly. You need temperatures, thousands of degrees to be able to break those fluorines from the carbons. It's an incredibly strong chemical bond. You can add water to it because they're a surfactant, it doesn't sort of dissolve like salt would into sodium and chlorine. There is no chemical that will dissolve them or break them down. High temperatures is about the only thing that will pull the fluorines from the carbons. We saw that with dioxins. Dioxins had a double carbon ring around the carbons. They needed high temperatures to break that apart. Saying that, one of the things that is being researched right now is that what is the impact of having impartial combustion send PFAS up the stacks of some of these incinerators trying to destroy them. There's some evidence that in the locale around these incinerators, there is some deposition of PFAS and PFOS.
We have time for one more question here. Could milorganite contain PFAS?
It could. It does have that potential because milorganite is paper mill sludge. And I've used it on my yard and my garden. It's a great organic fertilizer, soil amendment. But if the mill is a post-consumer mill or even a coated mill, so some mills are what's called coated, and in that coating, if any of the PFAS and PFOS were added, then there is a real risk that it does contain it.
Our last question here is actually a statement. Seems as though there is an urgent need for public education and increased research is needed to find alternatives to the use of PFAS.
I couldn't agree more. And again, all of you have incredible power here, and you can drive this discussion, sharing this information with others, starting to make these changes little at a time. In my world, we'll try to treat for these, but we have to work on this together.
Great. Well, that concludes everything today. Meleesa Johnson, Director of Solid Waste Management for Marathon County. Thank you so much for being here. You're always such a tremendous resource for our 72 counties. As a reminder, a PDF of today's presentation, as well as a recording, will be available at wicounties.org right on the homepage. You can also register for next Monday's workshop, Serving Our Aging Population, which will be on November 2nd. How's it November already? You can register right on the homepage for that. And finally, a huge shout out to our friends at Wisconsin Eye who live streamed this webinar today. So thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next week.